Dan, welcome to the program. In defense of Christian patriotism, I can't help but think that maybe this is a response to some of the folks that have been writing in defense of Christian nationalism. First of all, is that assumption accurate? And can you place your definition of Christian patriotism against Christian nationalism? What do they have in common? What's different?
So it's interesting. I actually didn't write it to directly to refute Christian nationalism. Um, I wrote it really, and you'll see as you probably see as you read the book, really as a pushback to some of the really the left kind of demonizing Christian participation in the public square, Christians who love their country, and this idea that you have to love your country or love God. You can't order those things well. Um, that sort of I think in the last several decades has been part of the narrative of both in among evangelicals and in the broader media. However, I do think it is kind of an antidote to to Christian nationalism. And I'm talking about the real Christian nationalism. You and I both know that term has been used as a pejorative against, anybody who's conservative, who loves their country, who brings their Christian ideas to the public square. But there are self-described Christian nationalists, as you know. I think they're a small but pretty loud cohort of folks who maybe are dissatisfied with the American experiment, with constitutional order, and long for sort of magisterial Protestantism or a Christian state, of a Christian Caesar or Protestant Franco, all that kind of stuff, which I think is, you know, n- not a good idea, not workable, nor possible in our current moment. But in some ways, what I'm trying to do is give people who have been a little bit burned by secularism or a little bit turned off by modernity a place to land without landing over there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things I really like about your book, especially in the beginning, is that you've already mentioned ordered liberty and
Hmm.
properly ordered affections.
Yeah.
You really kind of go back to first principles in the
Hmm.
early chapters of the book, and talk about these concepts of ordered liberty and what I guess maybe Augustine would call ordered affections, properly
Hmm.
ordered affections, and that you say that the real root of a Christian patriotism is love. It's the biblical command to love our neighbors as ourselves. Again, first of all, do I have that right? And can you say more about these ideas?
Yeah, I think so. And one of the arguments I've been making over the last couple of years, and I really tried to put it all together in this book, is if Jesus told us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we live in a unique country where we the people have been given agency and to shape the policies that affect our neighbors' flourishing, a voice and a vote. How can we say that we love our neighbors if we shrink back from that responsibility? And again, everyone has a different calling, so I'm not saying everyone has to run for office or everyone has to be write books or everyone has to be mad on Facebook at the same time. Um, but all of us have a responsibility to do that. And I kind of pair that with Jeremiah 29 too, right? To seek the welfare, the flourishing of our cities, even though we consider ourselves as exiles, right? We're citizens of the kingdom of God. But that doesn't mean we don't love the place where we're at. And as you notice, I kind of lean on Lewis and Chesterton and Augustine to think through these things. I think for many evangelicals, and Warren, you probably have noticed this too. The narrative, I think, from journalists and folks who look at evangelicals, the narrative is that every Sunday we're coming to church and it's we're getting handed RNC talking points and Ronald Reagan bobbleheads, and it's all politics all the time. The truth is, it's much different. Most of our churches are pretty pietistic and don't really talk about politics. Um, I think mostly that's good because people need to hear a word from the Lord and not hear what they get Monday through Friday. But there is this prevailing narrative among evangelicals, and this kind of sense that um, I got to be careful about loving my country. Um, I shouldn't be involved in politics. I shouldn't be involved in these kinds of things because I either have to choose loving the country or loving God. and you can't do both. And I think there's been a sort of, particularly conservative evangelicals sort of been shamed into that sort of thinking. And I try to help folks understand, no, it's not, it's very rarely a binary choice. Sometimes it is, right? Sometimes you have to disobey the state because you have to obey God. But a lot of times it's about ordering our loves. And so some people will come into this book and say, you know what? I can be more expressive about my love for country. I shouldn't be ashamed about flying the flag because I can order this well. Other people will come and maybe be a little chastened because those loves have gotten out of order. And maybe they're a little bit more like Jonah, where, their love of country has become too supreme. Maybe it's supplanted their love for God and they'll be chastened into more healthy patriotism. That's kind of my hope.
Well, since you mentioned Jonah, Dan, let me ask you to sort of unpack that story a little bit, because you unpack one of the things again I like about your book is that
Mhm.
you keep coming back to scripture as well.
Mhm.
One of the stories that you reference early in the book is the story of Jonah, and it has some lessons for the ideas we are discussing today. Can you quickly recount? I mean, I think most everybody knows the story of Jonah, but why you use that story? What are the relevant pieces of that story for your project today?
Well, I think it's a good reference point, because I advocate people be patriotic. I think love of country, as Richard John Newhouse said, is a species of discipleship, as he said, um, to be grateful and love the place God has put us. But it can go too far, and I think Jonah is a example of that. Jonah was a patriot. He had successfully prophesied flourishing and good times in Israel. He was close with the king, and while there were good times in Israel, there was also a time of idolatry, and God would later judge them for that. But Jonah got an assignment to go to Nineveh. Nineveh was Israel or Assyria. Nineveh was part of Assyria. Assyria is Israel's one of their chief threats, right? And they were a bloodthirsty people. They were known for their cruelty, um, savagery, and God told Jonah to go there and essentially warn them of God's judgment and off God's offer of repentance and salvation. And Jonah didn't want to do that. It's not because he didn't think they were beyond saving. It's because he knew God could do a work there, but he didn't want those people to experience that. And I think this is where love of country um can become, if our love of country causes us to be so myopic and inward that we hate the other nations, or we see them as lesser than human, or we don't want them to flourish, or people from other nations to flourish. I think that's where it becomes dangerous. That's where it becomes idolatrous, right? Um, Israel was always supposed to be blessed by God so that they could be a light to the nations. And when they Jonah sort of forgot that, right? He let his patriotism, or his love of his country, um, supplant the mission of God, and so it was out of order. Um, and I argue in the book, Jonah's problem wasn't that he loved America, or sorry, he loved America. That's anachronistic. Jonah's problem wasn't that he loved Israel. It's that his love of Israel was higher than his love for God, right? And so he needed to put it right in the proper ordering. So I think it's a good example of that. That can happen to us, right? If love for America, I love this country. I think this is the greatest experiment in human government ever in history. And yet, my love for America can't keep me from loving the nations, right? To take the gospel to the nations. When I see Revelation 5 and 7, where every nation, tribe, and tongue is gathered on the throne of God, God delights in the mosaic of every nation, tribe, and tongue gathered around Him. I think if we lose that, then we're in danger of a kind of over realized love of country.
Yeah. Well, Dan, you've introduced a couple of ideas that I'd like to drill down on just a
Mm-hmm.
bit, and that is the exceptionalism of America
Mm-hmm.
and maybe chief among them. You talk about that a little bit in the book, and I'd like for you to share some here, especially in this context. I mean, you and I are speaking in December of 2025. Next year, less than 30 days from now, the calendar turns over to 2026, the 250th anniversary year. We're going to hear a lot about America, a lot about our history.
Mm-hmm.
Ken Burns just released a documentary on the American Revolution that has been getting a lot of attention,
Mm-hmm.
and has been unpacking a bit this notion of American exceptionalism. What's your position on American exceptionalism? Yes, we are the greatest experiment in the history of the world. I think we should probably add so far to that.
Yeah.
Talk to me about American exceptionalism. Is it okay for Christians to believe in American exceptionalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I knew I wanted to put this chapter in the book. I wanted to cover the things that we're all talking about. How should we think? How can we be patriotic and still think about the good and bad parts of our history? And we can talk about that if you want later as well. And then I wanted to talk about American exceptionalism because it's everyone's thinking about it. So I a couple things I try to do. One is, I draw from Chesterton, who has a great essay on patriotism called On Patriotism, and also a book, What I Saw in America, that's worth reading from an outsider's perspective. And one of the things he says, and I think Lewis says this too, that of course you're going to think the place where you live is the best place. It's a natural thing to have an affection for your home. It springs from gratitude. You're naturally going to think your home, your place is the best place, right? I travel a little bit to go speaking and do things, but I always want to come back home. Not because I hate everywhere else I am, but the home is where that I prefer. I think about this in the terms of college football rivalries, right? Um, where I live in Texas, there's a lot of either Texas A&M fans or University of Texas fans. And both of those folks think their school is the best. They don't know why you'd go anywhere else. Why you cheer for anyone else? Some people even call the A&M folks like a cult. Um, and what it's funny, I've been to some games with some Aggie friends, and when I went there, they didn't like soften their love for A&M when I went there. They did all their weird rituals and all their stuff. They love it, and they will tell you 1,000 ways why A&M is the best school. I think it's a little bit like what we think about our country. It's okay. It's okay to think that way. Um, John Wilsey has a great book he came out with about a decade ago on American exceptionalism. John Wilsey teaches at Southern Seminary. He's a historian, a theologian, and he talks about open exceptionalism and closed exceptionalism. And he says, and you may draw the lines a little differently than he does, on the specifics, but his overall thesis is good. Where he says closed exceptionalism is we're the best country, that gives us the right to do whatever we want, right? So manifest destiny. We can conquer nations and convert them. We can do whatever we want. This sort of hubris. He says that's not a good form of exceptionalism. And I agree with that. He said there's another kind of exceptionalism. It's an open exceptionalism, which is what I read when I read the founders. This idea that God has blessed us. This is a great nation. To whom much is given, much is required. We better steward this well. We better be open-handed and generous with what God has given us. I think that's a really healthy version of exceptionalism. The other thing I also talk about in there is beyond the sort of natural biases you have for your homeland. Can we objectively say that America is different and is unique? And I think we can. I think when you look in terms of this idea of ordered liberty, this idea of the consent of the governed, David McCullough said, this project, this has never been tried before. This is the first time it's ever been tried. You mentioned Ken Burns. I just read a quote by him, which I thought just astounding. He said the American Revolution is the greatest event in human history besides the birth of Christ, besides the entrance of Christ into the world. And Ken Burns not some raging Christian nationalist or anything. He's just saying, look how good this is. Now, when we say American exceptionalism, it doesn't mean that we're saying it gives us the right to do everything we want. It doesn't mean we're saying that America's never made mistakes. We've made grievous mistakes and sins. And I have a whole chapter on how we should think through that. But it does recognize and say, this is a pretty special thing we've got. And I think the more you travel, Warren, the more you read history, you see that, right? Jonah Goldberg talks about how freedom is unnatural. Typically in the history of the world, you have tyranny, you have savagery. And so even though we look at America today and say, man, there's a lot of issues and problems, and I can give you a list of 100 things I wish were different. When you compare it to world history, you're saying, this is pretty special. It's not the kingdom of God. It's not perfect, but it's pretty special.
Yeah, yeah. I don't mean to go down a rabbit trail here, Dan, but
Yeah.
I've been interested in the wicked phenomenon on in the movies, and the Wizard of Oz
Mm-hmm.
story. And I've basically, and I'm not a fan necessarily. I mean, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen one of the Wicked movies or the musical.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen, of course, the Wizard of Oz. It was unavoidable when I was a kid.
Right.
But I've become convinced that one of the reasons that the Wizard of Oz story has such resonance and has had such staying power and has been explored from all kinds of different angles is that notion of home. I mean, Dorothy and Toto and her compadres, they travel to bizarre places, exotic lands, the Emerald City, the Yellow Brick Road. They see flying monkeys and witches. And yet at the end of, I mean, after seeing all of that, having all of those adventures, what's the line that sticks with Dorothy and with us? Oh, Annie M, there's no place like home, right?
Right.
And I think you've articulated that, and I do think that that is a powerful impulse. And I, in Acts chapter 17 says that God Himself, in His sovereignty, placed us in this moment, in this
Mm-hmm.
place. He has circumscribed the boundaries of our dwelling place. So
Absolutely.
if we hate our home, if we hate our country, in some ways we are, it's an affront to the sovereignty of God and His choice to place us here in this time. Is that overstating it?
No, I think you're exactly right. And this is one of the things I'm getting at because I think, it strikes me like on the 4th of July, even well-meaning, even otherwise conservative Bible-believing Christians feel like they have to condition their love for America or apologize for it, right? They offer a million caveats like glad to be an American, but here's 15 things wrong with the country, which is a weird thing to do on someone's birthday, right? If I did that with my wife, like happy birthday, but here's 8 things wrong, probably wouldn't be married for 23 years like I am. Um, and I think there's this almost sense that you have to, if you don't loathe America, if you don't say that America is a fundamentally failed project or a, racist project from the beginning, that's all we've ever done, or on the other side, yeah, that might be on the left, on the right, just kind of like, we've lost the country because of all this stuff. If you don't do that, then you're somehow, it's cringy to say you love your country. And I don't think, as you said, um, it's about gratitude. It's about stewardship of our land. Um, and I think if you care about injustice or you are frustrated with things in the country, love is a better motivator for repair than indifference or hatred. This is one of the arguments I really try to make in the book that why I so disagree with projects like the 1619 project, or maybe folks on the other side, the sort of the far right, that have said, the whole thing has failed and the Constitution doesn't work and all that kind of stuff. You can't, if you have no basis, if you have no shared national pride or love or a sense of stewardship, you're not going to motivate people to make change. Think of the great social reformers in American history. They all revered the Constitution. I mean, Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" He reveres the founders. He thinks the founding ideals are great. He's just saying, hey, we haven't lived up to them. And we have not lived up to these promises. This is what Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address. This is what Martin Luther King said, right? This is what I think we're saying when we make a pro-life argument that, hey, if all men are created equal, let's extend that to all human beings. If you don't have that sort of North Star like that, I think it's hard to make change. It's hard. So it actually works against itself. I also think cynicism and nihilism is lazy. Um, you know, cynicism to me is naivete without a smile. It's just easily writing off everything. Whereas discernment and engagement requires much more effort, but it's much more rewarding. And so if we are here as God's people, and God has put us here in this place in this time as Americans, we ask ourselves, how do we steward this? And America 250 is a good opportunity to reflect and say, this is a good country of good ideals. How do we renew the country for the next 250 years? How do we ensure that our children and grandchildren can enjoy the blessings of liberty uh, and the fruitfulness of liberty like we did? And part of that, I think, is, and I talk a lot about this in the book, is, you know, shoring up our Christian, the sort of Christian, the understanding of the Christian foundations of the country, engaging the public square. I think we should pray for renewal, for revival, but being engaged locally and nationally so that our children and grandchildren have a better place than we do. I had a great conversation one time with Kristen Wagner at ADF, and one thing she said to me that I'll never forget is, we're doing this work on religious liberty, not just for our time, but so that my kids and grandkids can enjoy the freedom of worship. I want my kids and grandkids to be able to go to church freely without being harassed by the government. And I was like, I never thought of it that way, but that is so true. And I think if you broaden that out, we should think that about the country. Um, and you will only renew and repair things you love, right? My children, I have 4 kids. I have 3 teenagers and a college student. If I see some things in my kids that I don't like, or I'm trying to train and correct them, I can only do that from a place of love. If I tell them how terrible they are and how failed they are and how much a disgrace they are, that doesn't motivate them to change. But if I do it from a place of love, that I love you and I see the best in you, but I really think if you want to really have a fruitful and flourishing life, here's the things you need to really change and do, they're going to be more receptive to that.
Well, Dan, you've already answered a good bit of what I was going to ask to kind of try to land this airplane to bring our conversation to a close, and that is to pivot a bit to the how question.
Mm-hmm.
And you answered some of that just now. We should pray for our country. We should become informed, that sort of thing. But let me push on those answers just a bit, because while obviously I agree with those answers, and I think that that's
Mm-hmm.
really good advice, we live in an environment in which even keeping ourselves informed, even praying wisely and with discernment and in an informed way is difficult, because there are so many voices in the media and other places that are trying to muddle and confuse uh, even these basic and I think biblical tasks. So how now shall we then live? I guess I would say, given this current moment, if we want to be truly Christian patriots, not Christian nationalists, if we want to love our country, love our neighbors, what does that look like today?
That's a great question. And, in the back half of the book, I really talk about several areas to get involved. So once we think about patriotism, and I talk about the local church, being involved in a good local church, I talk about education, the family, and in our communities, and renewing each of these institutions. Um, I think as Christians, the most important thing is the spiritual disciplines. And I think of James 1:27, I think it says true religion is caring for widows and orphans, and being unspotted from the world. And one of the things that's so interesting about what James is saying is that true authentic faith is both um, inside and outside, right? That it's the internal matters of the heart and spiritual disciplines, and then going outward into the world and caring for the most vulnerable. And so he's saying two things at the same time. One, that you can't just stay in your prayer closet, that if you are truly following Christ and have a genuine faith, it should take you from, from your church and from your spiritual disciplines out into the world. It should be an active faith. But he's also saying, I think this is really important, that your life in the world is only as good as your life with God, right? So those spiritual disciplines matter. Life in community in your church matters. Your families matter. I think this is an era that really requires real discernment. And I think churches and pastors need to talk more about this. As you mentioned, there's so many voices vying for our attention. It's a crowded media marketplace. Everybody's got a microphone. Everybody's got a platform, and we have to really be wise about our spiritual diet, and wise about you know our new media intake, our news intake. I think instead of telling people to just log off and get offline, and for some that may be the case. I mean, there are people that really do need to log off because they've gone a little crazy. They're too online, as we might say. But I think instead of telling people just completely log off, I think we need to give people tools for how to discern what is true, what is right, what is beautiful, and what isn't. Um, and maintaining that sort of diet of news and information that comes into us. I don't think we should put our head in the sand and ignore everything. But I also don't think, I do think we need to really steward what goes into our minds. When I was a kid, I grew up in a pretty strict household, but one of the things we were taught was, garbage in, garbage out. And most of that was a reference to sort of like Hollywood and entertainment. And I still think that's true, right? But I think we need to take that approach with our media diet, that not every voice is a good voice. And this is especially important when you're listening to voices that might align with you politically, right? I think heresy comes in through the back door. Untruth comes in through the back door, right? And there may be voices that align with you on certain issues or on the same side of the aisle as you, but you still have to be discerning, right? I'm a conservative. I'm a Ronald Reagan conservative, always have been. I read a wide variety of conservative stuff. Just because something is on the right per se doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy and good, right? And so we need to be wise. We need to be guided by scripture. And Satan wants to distract us from the real work. I think sometimes we think merely being loud online or expressing your opinion is the extent of kind of cultural engagement or renewing the country. Actually, we really want to renew the country. We'll double down on our families. We'll double down on our church. We'll get involved locally to build and renew our institutions. That kind of work. Rolling up our sleeves is what really makes America great. I mean, Tocqueville, when he came here, he noticed the local associations and the creating institutions are what made America great. And I think doing that kind of work is important for the next 250 years.
Dan, that is a good word to close on. I am grateful for your book. I have found it to be nourishing, as I have found your previous books. Before we go, I can't resist asking a question that I often ask folks, and that is there just something you want to say that I'm not smart enough to ask and that we didn't cover, or something that we did cover that is kind of your elevator speech for this book, just the one big idea that you want to make sure doesn't get lost in all the words that we've shared with each other today?
That's a great question. I think I would say two things. I would say, you alluded to this before, but Christians should not live with fear. God has made us for this moment, and God has not made us for 50 years ago or 50 years from now, but for this precise moment. And he has given us all we need as American Christians to live faithfully, to steward what we have, to build and renew the country for the next generation, which I think is good, important work. I think most of that is going to happen through the local church, through gospel preaching, through church planning and revival, but also us getting involved and rolling up our sleeves in local school boards and elections and really shaping public policy. And the kind of person we are matters. It's not just important for us to be on the right side of issues, to be present in all these places, but to be a Christian in these spaces, right? And maintain our Christian testimony as we do that. I think the second thing is, and this might be a pet thing of mine, but having read stuff by like Brad Wilcox and others, I really think one of the main ways that we can renew this country is for Christians to really roll up our sleeves and help strengthen families and strengthen marriages. If you understand and read all the data, like a lot of our social ills are downstream from the breakdown of the family. And what can churches do to help marriages stay healthy and strong, to encourage marriage, to encourage good families? What kind of policy can we enact that helps, economically and other ways strengthen the family? I want to encourage people to do that. We can be mad online all day at the politicians we don't like, and sometimes it's important to speak out. But in our communities, there's hurting families that the church can really rush to help meet their needs and strengthen. So that's a word that I have, that this is something we can do right now today, regardless of who's in office and who's winning elections.
And Darlene, thanks so much for being on the program today. I'm grateful.
Well, thank you, Warren. I appreciate it. Appreciate all the good work that you do.